the fact that in order for them to understand the issue, they have to be educated about it, because the awareness has to be there. And I think the need for sensitization, more education among this vulnerable group has to take place. The effects of climate change is real, and it's not just real for the normal citizens, but Amerindians or indigenous people too. And just to reflect back on my first article I did, Hipolito, the effect on Amerindian staple, we're seeing continuously seeing the effects on that staple across the country. We've moved to the point where cassava was grown in abundance. It was used for local consumption. It was exported. Now, Amerindian villages are not even getting to consume it. They're buying from other places. And there is a shortage of cassava. You know, I spoke about it in that article, the process of planting and all of that. But floods come, it destroys the crop. It affects the family to put food on the table. And that's one of there are so many ways Amerindians or indigenous people use cassava. They use it as a drink, they use it as a staple, you know. And so that alone is affecting them, much less their mental health. And if they're not aware of the effects of climate change on their mental health, then that is certainly an issue that we need to be able to advocate as media workers, journalists, and policymakers, and NGOs, even the activists, to ensure that we go into these communities wherever they are and educate them about how climate change is linked to mental health. And they too could probably say to themselves, oh, I am really being affected by climate change. My mental health is being impacted, you know, and then they will be able to access the services that they need.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Caribbean Climate Calabash. My name is Hipolito. I am joined by Candice and Samuel. And the topic we'll be discussing today will be climate change and its impacts on mental health in indigenous people in Jamaica and Guyana. Samuel and Candice, welcome. How are you guys doing today?
Thank you. I'm good. Thank you.
Hey, everyone. I'm all right. Hipolito, the minute you started to speak, the dogs in my background started to bark. So I'm doing a big face palm right now, but I'm good. I'm good.
That's fine. That's fine. We love animals. At the moment, I have my cat Paige. She's meowing like crazy. Just I hope it doesn't deserve the conversation. Okay, so one of the things that a lot of people don't understand or don't truly get is that climate change affects every single thing, including the mental health. And it becomes worse when it affects the mental health of vulnerable groups like indigenous people. Now, you guys worked on an article, researched this information. So let's start off with you, Candice. Can you give us a brief overview of what the article looked at? And some of the findings on the intersection of climate change and mental health in both countries, Jamaica and Guyana.
Right. So as you said, it was a collaborative piece. Actually, the article focused on 3 countries, but for the purpose of this recording, we're looking at 2, Guyana and Jamaica. So it's really, I'd like to say it's a fusion of experiences from an indigenous point of view. So where Jamaica is concerned, I focused on the Taino people. More specifically, I focused on the Yamé-Guani Taino peoples of Jamaica. And in English, it's called the Jamaica Hummingbird Taino peoples, and their experience as far as climate change and seeking climate justice is concerned. But back to the article, you know, it focuses on the mental health, how climate change events negatively impact people in terms of their behavior. It also looks at displacement and what displacement means when climate change events occur, as well as just the overall existence of indigenous peoples, their homeland.
Samuel, would you like to chime in?
Sure. I think it was one of the most interesting, if not one of the best collaborative pieces we've done in this fellowship. I think it brought together the vulnerability of the indigenous communities in all three countries, particularly as we are discussing the Jamaican and Guyanese indigenous communities. And very often we tend to forget that small population of our entire country, they're most vulnerable to certain events, especially climate change. And in this particular instance, mental health was one of the the issues that we covered. For the most part, I thought that, how do I get people to talk about mental health and how climate change is affecting their mental health, especially in a community where um, most the education level is not that high in Guyana, because of the areas in which they live and the access to tertiary education and all of that. But it was quite interesting to hear the views, the comments, and the opinions of these people, our first people in Guyana, how climate change is affecting their lives in so many ways, particularly mental health. And from my own interviews and my contribution to the collaborative piece, I can safely say that this is an issue. It certainly is an issue, and highlighting it, is one way of ensuring that we uh, start focusing, policymakers, governments, and people who look after the affairs of First Peoples or Indigenous people. This is something that they must look into. That climate change is having an effect on people's mental health. And certainly that collaborative piece was very in depth, and it brought together, the stories from each country, showing the similarities, but yet the differences in each country.
So some of the persons you interviewed, did they know that their mental health is being affected by climate change, or is it something that you had to explain to them?
First, for some of them, I had to explain, climate change, and you have to go into that's their setting, of course. When you go to those villages, you speak the Creole, you try to take them down to that level, and you say, man, climate change is affecting your food, because I did my first story on how it's affecting indigenous staple called cassava, and when I had to explain that too. So when it came to mental health, people were like, mental health and climate change. So I had to explain how that affects you too, because of course, if you have pockets of small Amerindian villages, they're mostly dependent on subsistence farming, you know. Climate change affects their mental health because in most cases they don't have food to put on the table for their families. And people, of course, don't see that this whole issue of being a mental health issue, they don't see the stress, the anxiety that is attached to it. They think, oh, it's part of a normal life cycle, but it is linked to climate change, because climate change, of course, affects your planting, your subsistence farming, and that in itself, if you can't provide for your family, then it causes a mental health challenge for you. And in some cases, people tend to move, and especially in those indigenous communities in Ghana, they move to the abuse of alcohol and drugs and all of that, and in some cases suicide. While I did not have a specific link to whether this has caused people to commit suicide, the organizations that I spoke with did point out that there are cases where that could have been the case, but it was not properly documented because, of course, mental health and climate change, that link is a quite new topic that some people are not even aware of. So people are
Mhm.
now examining how climate change is affecting people's mental health, especially for those vulnerable groups.
Yeah. So Candice, was it the same thing for you in terms of the people you spoke to, not knowing that climate change is affecting their mental health? And did you receive any sort of like shocking information when speaking to these individuals, something that you couldn't believe that they were going through because of climate change?
No, I was not shocked by anything that I learned. However, I should say that conversely to what Samuel has just shared, when he actually went into the community and spoke with these First Peoples, for me, it wasn't the case. So the Taino people in Jamaica are not in a standalone community. They are dispersed. And the reason they are dispersed has a lot to do with history. It has a lot to do with displacement through history. And a lot of that has to do with climate change events, such as hurricanes and the secondary effects of hurricanes, like flooding, land slippage, and all of that. I spoke with Chieftainess Ronalda Pearman. She is the wife of Chief Kalan of the Yamegwanai Taino peoples. And for her, she completely understood or understands what we mean when we talk about mental health being negatively impacted or just impacted across the board because of climate change events. From her perspective, though, she stressed and focused a lot on the connection to the land. So one of the things that stood out to me when we spoke was that she said essentially, or the essence of who they are is tied into the land, tied into their ancestral land, the land that their ancestors lived, worked, essentially carried out their everyday lives, but they are dispersed in residential areas across the island. She lives in Kingston, and there are people from that same group who are in different parishes or different areas of the same parish that she lives in with her family. And she said it's a traumatic experience, when you even though the focus was on or is on Indigenous people or Taino people, she said anybody would be affected by that. If you grow up in a specific community for all your life, and then something as traumatic as a category 5 hurricane, for example, should strike, blow off your roof, flood out your place to the point where it is no longer habitable. You have to move, you have to go somewhere else. And in moving, in that displacement, you lose your physical connection with the tree that was at the front of your yard, for example. And from her perspective, on behalf of the Taino people of Jamaica, she said something to the tune of, your mother or your great grandmother or your grandfather, people who you would have grown up with, to help you connect to your culture and your practices. When you leave that space, that tie is kind of broken. And then when you leave and then you have children of your own, you want to try as best as possible to ensure that they are connected. But it is kind of difficult to do that when you're not in the physical space to teach them and show them. Yes, you can still hold on to certain practices, but it is even more difficult because you're in a new space. You're not necessarily surrounded by your people, if you get what I mean. So you have to be mindful of some of the practices, but I don't want to go too far ahead. I want us to take our time. So I have other things to share where that's concerned.
Yeah, and one of the things a lot of people don't realize is that children are in this situation, and the impacts are long lasting. So okay, so a lot of the Caribbean leaders, a lot of the Caribbean countries are talking that okay, so the big polluter countries are not doing enough to battle climate change or to mitigate or adapt to the effects of climate change. Mental health, as far as I'm concerned, is not something spoken about when it comes to the international events there. We are speaking it now, and I think a lot of people who go through this are grateful. So let me ask this, right? And basically it would be in a format of a test or exam question. Do you believe, in your individual countries, do you believe that the government is doing enough to address the effects of climate change of mental health? Yes or no? Explain your answer. Who wants to go first?
As in on indigenous people or people in general?
People in general, in the country.
Samuel, you want to take that first?
Sure, no problem. I would say yes, based on the resources that are available. You see, mental health is a very couple of years ago, probably they'll say mental health and climate change is a taboo topic. Right now, small island developing countries and those in low-lying South Africa, like Guyana and Suriname, most of their expenditure to fight climate change is spent on building up infrastructure. So when you have all your expenditure going towards your finances going towards building up the infrastructure to alleviate climate change effects, like Guyana, low-lying coastal country, you protect your people from floods. So you don't have the resources, the human resource capacity, nor the finances to, do a study on how climate change is impacting people, any people, your entire citizenry in the country. So I think, based on your question, I think the government of the day in Guyana is doing all it can when it comes to ensuring that it fights climate change. But as you rightfully said, the major countries, the major superpowers in this world, they have a responsibility to ensure that these countries get their financial resources to do what they can to protect their countries, because they're the bigger polluters. Look, Guyana, for example, is covered in more than 80% of rainforests. Our population is just over 700,000, most of them living in the coastal region. And where we live, we are protected by seawalls. So we are constantly building up our seawall. We've expanded the mangrove program to protect, the seashore. But when you talk about mental health and other more peculiar topics to climate change, I don't think we have the resources. Small countries like ours have the resources to address those issues.
It's for me, it's kind of difficult to really respond to this question, just because from where I stand or where I sit, the two are not necessarily paired. Yeah, they're not necessarily paired. So whereas we, or let me say not we, but our leaders focus on mental health because it is one of, not necessarily the pillars, but one of the focal points of our Ministry of Health and Wellness. It's not, I have not seen where it's tied to climate change and climate resilience. We do focus on climate change and climate resilience. Maybe we could do much more in terms of, ensuring that infrastructure is in place, or infrastructure is retrofitted and all of that, because we are, and I think this is across the board for most small island developing states where flooding is concerned, and us doing preparation work for the next hurricane season at the beginning of the hurricane season and those kinds of things. However, to pair the two, I have not seen where that happens. I have not seen where we focus on ensuring that if displacement happens because of flooding or land slippage, that priority is placed on ensuring that there is mental first aid or psychological first aid for those people who are impacted. The primary goal just tends to be ensuring that they get to somewhere else that is safe, perhaps a shelter. Yes, indirectly that helps to calm the nerves, and it helps to settle any mental frustration that occurs, but to say it's done directly to help people in mental distress because of climate change events. No, that's a roundabout way of responding to the question, but my short answer is I don't think we focus a lot on the two together. We focus on them separately for sure, but not together. Much more can be done.
In your opinion, why do you think that is the case? Is it that the linkage they're not seeing is strong enough, or is it that if they see that link, the intersection between the two, then it would be, you know what, we'll need to spend more resources, we need to do more work. It becomes more of our responsibility to do so. So it's better just to do, because some government ministries across the Caribbean, for them it's better just to do the minimum. Get them to say if they get them somewhere to stay, and that's basically. People tend to forget about the mental aspect of things. They tend to forget that people go through traumatic experience. Now, your traumatic experience may be different than mine, but they don't realize that that's a factor of everything. Why do you believe that they're not seeing the link, or they purposely are ignoring the link between climate change and mental health?
I don't think it's done purposely. I think we have so many other issues plaguing our country that we inadvertently push it to not the back, but close enough to the back where they can try and focus more on the concerns of today. Crime and violence. That is, and in my estimation, forever will be, at least in the near future, the foreseeable future, will be at the forefront of every discussion. And even that, crime and violence impacts mental health, right? But the focus tends to be on getting rid of the powers inflicting these crimes on the nation, trying to get that under control. And then when we get that under control, we can focus on other things. So I personally don't think that it's done on purpose. It's just that there are more pressing matters, in my estimation. And mental health concerns and taking care of your mental and mental wellness is a relatively new concept where focus is placed on it. Yes, it has always been a point of discussion for like psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors and people within that space, but on a grander scale it's fairly new, like maybe since the last within the decade. Before that, not so much, but people have come to realize that where there is no mental wellness, there is an automatic breakdown of every other construct in society. I don't want it to sound like a talk shop, because every other meeting or podcast or whatever it is, they focus on those things. And to the people who are not necessarily in the spaces that we are in, they might say, oh, here you go, another group of people just chatting away about the same topic, because they know it's a talking point. Yes, it is a talking point, but it goes further than that. Climate change and climate justice goes hand in hand with the mental health of the people who are impacted by those events, right? And it's not just, when I spoke with Chieftainess Ronaldo, she said the same thing to me. She said that, yeah, I mean, the mental health of Indigenous people are affected, but it's not just we. And not just we get impacted by these things, everybody. Yes, I know the focus is on our community and similar communities across the region, sure. And we are placed in vulnerable situations, or more vulnerable situations, because for the most part we're not recognized. Yes, governments may have signed off on ILO 169, which is for the protection of Indigenous people, but have they ratified it? I'm not sure about Guyana, Samuel, but I know for sure that in Jamaica it's not ratified. And when I spoke with Chieftainess Ronaldo, she said in very clear terms that, it's almost disrespectful, or not almost. I don't want to quote her because I don't remember exactly what she said, but it's to the point where, yeah, we're cool with the Taino people, we're cool with the indigenous people, but that is it. And because it is not ratified, they essentially have no rights as indigenous people. They have rights as Jamaicans because that's them born and grow here. But to seek climate justice from that perspective, to seek any kind of justice if they're impacted by any other issue within the country, them can't do it as indigenous people because of that.
Are indigenous peoples in your country, do you believe that they believe that they are being disrespected, one, and as indigenous people they are seen as second-class citizens?
Oof, I don't know. I don't want to say that I'm speaking on behalf of them because I'm not. I'm just speaking from my observation and the conversations that I would have. And to some extent, yes, and some extent, no. Because they do have a working relationship with the government. They do have a working relationship with government entities, right? It's just that one thing that kind of holds them back from getting to that next step forward. So an example is that the Yami Guani Taino peoples, they don't have, and this is from what Chieftainess Ronaldo told me, they don't have their own meeting space. They share a space with various maroon communities within Jamaica. They don't have their own community space. If the ratification was in place, policies would follow that. And once policies follow that, in my estimation at least, they would be able to say, yes, they have this space so that they can meet and, perform ceremonial rituals and all. I don't know. And I don't want it to seem like they're not represented as they ought to be, because as I said, they have a great relationship with government entities such as the Institute of Jamaica, the museums. Some artifacts are on display in the museums and all of that, and they have relationships with many schools. A series of presentations are done to ensure that kids know that Tainos are not extinct. They're very much present and alive. Many people, because of the displacement, are not necessarily aware that they are of indigenous descent, So, and that in and of itself adds to the trauma because you're not connected to who you really are.
Thank you. Okay, so Samuel in Guyana, same question. Do you believe that indigenous people in Guyana are given the maximum respect and not only seen as the vulnerable group, the indigenous peoples?
Well, I think the situation in Guyana is a bit different from other Caribbean countries. Particularly, we have a established Ministry of Amerindian Affairs that looks after the affairs of the indigenous people. That ministry has various departments that deals with youth and other affairs and so on. We have just about over 10% of our population is indigenous or Amerindian people. I think my story made reference to the amount of people, which is just over 68,000, because our population is not that big. So yeah, we have representation, and we do also have rights group. Just to take you back to the point, why with the question why when you asked whether the government is doing enough to fight climate, protect its people from the effects of climate change. Why I said yes is because Guyana, the Guyanese government, and I'm not the spokesperson for the government, but why I said yes is because the successive Guyanese government has done their part to ensure that the rights of indigenous peoples are protected. And when it comes to climate change, this is a serious matter. The current government, um, when they were in office previously in 2009, Ghana signed an agreement with Norway, a groundbreaking agreement creating the world's second largest national level RED Plus scheme, where we received a lot of funding from Norway over a period of time. And some of those monies were distributed to indigenous or Amerindian villages to help fight climate change because they're the protectors of the forest. Um, so that money was sent there. And even with the recent HES agreement that we signed for US $750 million, US 112 million, US 112 million under the new inked agreement, carbon credit went to Amerindian villages. So they're also now building resilience through various projects. The money has been dispersed to these Amerindian villages. We also have a system, we call it the National Tushao Council, where there's a village leader for every Amerindian community. And with that National Tushao Council, we have a yearly uh, council meeting where they raise their concerns, whether it's climate change or access to education or healthcare or whatever the case may be. So through that mechanism, the money is dispersed to the National Tushao Council and the individual village leaders. So, and at every village, although there's a Tushao or a village leader, there's also an elected body that oversee the management of the community or village, and they made requests for the money for various projects. Some of them are using the money to uh, build solar systems because of course the interior they don't have access to electricity as the coast. So when I said yes to that question is to show that the Guyanese government has indeed invested a lot. But when it comes to your second question in terms of whether their rights are protected, that will always be a continuous battle. We have rights activists, we have various non-governmental organizations that does their work separately with these indigenous communities. Of course, they some of the issues they don't see eye to eye with the government. But generally, I think the situation in Ghana when it comes to the rights of indigenous people, it's far more different than most Caribbean countries. And we do we have ratified that, of course, the UN Convention. We have several mechanisms in place to ensure that issues of youth and unemployment, even to that matter, we have a program that helps young people to get employment in the indigenous communities. I think when it comes to climate change and climate justice, that is being worked out. Mental health, of course, is another area that we hope that the ministry can take up. And I'm sure they've seen the stories about mental health and its effect on vulnerable communities, including indigenous people. So, yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the individual self, a person and a single person living amongst the indigenous people, being part of the indigenous people. How is it that that person overcomes the challenges of mental health? I know you mentioned, Candice and Samuel, that the government is doing in terms of infrastructure and how that indirectly helps them in their mental health. But that individual self, during your research and during doing this story, did you manage to ask them or speak to them, how is it that they help themselves? Because while we depend on the government for everything, they don't always come through. Most of the time, they come through 100%. How is it that the individual self deals with mental health?
Well, first off, for Guyana, a couple of years back, I traveled to a very remote indigenous village with the Minister of Amerindian Affairs. And at that time, we already signed the pact with Norway to get climate funding. And I was so surprised at them, having one-on-one interaction with village leaders and other people in the community. Some of them did not actually believe that climate change was real, you know? they felt that, it's part of a normal thing to happen. They didn't know that the science behind it and all of that. And I think based on that, over the years, the government had to do, and the activists and NGOs had to do more work to bring them up to par with the fact that climate change is something real and how it is linked to science and all of that. And I think for the most part, that has changed. Not everyone believes that climate change is real in indigenous communities. Um, and I guess it has to do with their exposure to the coast and their access to education and all of that. So back then it was that. I don't think it has changed to some extent because they're more informed through various workshops and all of that. But to get to the point where indigenous people uh, will go to access mental health services for themselves because they think climate change is affecting their mental health. I don't think we've reached that stage because just a couple of years ago we were talking about, oh, climate change is not real. It's flooding our communities. It's destroying our livelihood, our staple, and everything. But they didn't have an understanding of how it's linked. And so to ask someone in an Amerindian village if they think that their mental health is being affected by climate change, they probably would ask you what. So these are things that must be highlighted, especially through our journalism work and more sensitization, because re- and you have to take into account that Ghana is quite different again because majority of our population is on the coast, and the Amerindian villages are located in very dense populated forested areas, and their access to the coast are not always, they don't come here in Georgetown, in the capital, every month, or and sometimes if they need a very urgent medical intervention, they have to be flown hours to come to the capital. So their access to mental health services and educational services are different from us. So I think altogether the issue of mental health and climate change, I don't think is something known by these villagers. Some of them, the activists who work in these communities, have been doing their part to educate them on how this is and how they can access the services. But generally in our country, Ghana, I don't think people, there's a stigma attached to that too, because as you might be aware, Ghana at one time had the largest suicide rate in this hemisphere. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, so access to mental health services, there's a stigma attached to that. So I think a lot of work has to be done, not just on a national level, but even in indigenous or Amerindian communities.
And this in Jamaica, how is it that the indigenous people, the individual self, what they are doing to help themselves when it comes to effects of climate change?
So this is a multi-tiered response, I think. I asked a similar question when I was speaking with Chieftainess Ronaldo, and she said, mental health reprieve, how for us, how we are just like everybody else. We are not, in general terms, not seen as First People. We're not seen as Indigenous people. We're just seen as Jamaicans. So if we want to seek help for mental health concerns, we have to go find the psychologist down the road or from wherever. That aside, she said to me that, as I said earlier, their climate change and mental health comes directly from the land. And Samuel, you mentioned that in Guyana, the coastline is technically home, right? Chieftainess Ronaldo said that in most cases, the coastline is no longer home because of sea level rise. So they've had to try and adapt to that. Fishing used to be a primary source of income. That's, you know, what they would do, but not so much anymore. She did tell me that fishing is still a major aspect of their livelihood, but they've had to adapt and try to do other things. So they focus more on their Kanoko. I'm trying to use a lot of the terminology that she used with me, and Kanoko means garden, right? Or I guess loosely it could mean small scale farming. She said to some extent they still focus on that, and in order to maintain their mental health and their connection to the land, because that's their primary concern, they have a one-on-one then with Father Sky, who they refer to as Yukahu, and I believe Father Sky is related to fertility. So when they greet the sun in the morning, and if they want to plant something for sustenance for themselves and their family, they connect with Father Sky. And in doing so, if done properly and done correctly, they will reap a lot and, you know, bear fruit continuously. She said that Atabe, who is known as Mother Earth, they try to connect with her a lot. And back to the Kanoko with gardening, they connect with Atabe in that way. And they tend to do a lot of their own grow your own food type of situation to feed themselves. But that aside, to connect and maintain their mental health from a personal or individual level, they go back to what matters the most, and that's community. So whereas they don't live in a communal space or a standalone community, what they do is they meet up at various points of the year, and they also use technology like WhatsApp. So if they want to engage in a specific ceremonial practice that can be done in some different way via WhatsApp, they do that, or they do it individually, and then they jump in the group chat, you know, like how you have your different group chats with your friends, and say, hey guys, guess what I did? And they take pictures or video if possible. I greeted the sun this morning, or I had a conversation with Yukahu or Atabe, and look at the Kanoko, you see how much fruits and vegetables my plant and it'll grow and everything and all of that. She also mentioned to me that being able to teach people about First People of Jamaica and the Indigenous community and their practices is a part of them connecting back to their community and maintaining their mental health. So the very act of teaching people about who they are and what they do, and the very fact that they are not extinct, it helps them in some way. In the events that we host, we involve the schools as well as the public and private sector. One of the events held annually in March, the protection of our rivers. This year in particular, which would have been 2023, we spoke about climate change and giving back to Atabe, which, as I said, is Mother Earth. That was crucial for us because of the relationship we share with the land. Instead of keeping the knowledge within our communities and within ourselves, we take matters into our hands by teaching the public about how we give back to Atabe. We do it in a palatable manner where we hold on to our traditions without persecution, and still we sensitize. And that last part is important because having conversations with Atabe or Father Sky, for example, to the non-Indigenous people can sometimes look like obia, in Jamaican terms, and though it is not necessarily punishable by law, it is looked down upon and frowned upon. And if you, an Indigenous person, greeting the sun in the morning or talking to your kanuku, and it's not the regular having conversations with your plants, it's more than that. I'm not entirely sure of the depths of it, but based on what she said, it is definitely more than that. To the onlooker, it's going to look strange, and people are going to look at you sideways and say, what are you doing? You shouldn't be doing that. That's, some might even say it's evil. And that alone, you know, can hold somebody up, hold them up, and they might be scared or afraid to outwardly practice who they are. And though it is secondary, it still is as a result of the displacement caused by climate change events. Not just climate change events, but that is definitely a part of it. Yeah.
The people fear what they do not understand. And I think in Belize, it's kind of like with the Mayas. I mean, I've interviewed several Maya priestess, and they, you know, during the interview, talking the sun, talking the forest god, and what have you. And I'm glad it hasn't come to that in Belize, that they're not chastised, or they're not, like, people are looking at them weird. So what are you talking about? You know, but thank you for that. Okay. So we're at the end of the podcast, and we spoke about the effects of climate change on mental health on Indigenous peoples, right? We spoke what they're going through, the article you guys both wrote in Guyana and Jamaica, what the Indigenous people are doing to help themselves alleviate the problem of mental health caused by climate crisis. Now we must talk about what possible solution there must be, because people listening to us will say, you say, I'll then do the talk, shop. But they propose no solutions. So let me ask you this, Candice, and then Samuel, you can go first. What should be the solution? And mind you that the government has a responsibility, a part of the responsibility to be a part of the solution, because they were elected to deal with these issues that the citizens, that the voters, that their constituency are dealing with. So Samuel, you go first. What should be the solution to address the impacts of the climate crisis on mental health on Indigenous peoples in Guyana?
I think there's need for more sensitization. There's a never-ending cycle of educating people about this, and like I said before, the fact that in order for them to understand the issue, they have to be educated about it, because the awareness has to be there. And I think the need for sensitization, more education among this vulnerable group has to take place. The effects of climate change is real, and it's not just real for the normal citizens, but Amerindians or Indigenous people too. And just to reflect back on my first article I did, Hipolito, the effect on Amerindian staple, we're seeing continuously seeing the effects on that staple across the country. We've moved to the point where cassava was grown in abundance. It was used for local consumption. It was exported. Now, Amerindian villages are not even getting to consume it. They're buying from other places. And there is a shortage of cassava. You know, I spoke about it in that article, the process of planting and all of that. But floods come, it destroys the crop, it affects the family to put food on the table, and that's one of there are so many ways Amerindians or Indigenous people use cassava. They use it as a drink, they use it as a staple, you know. And so that alone is affecting them, much less their mental health. And if they're not aware of the effects of climate change on their mental health, then that is certainly an issue that we need to be able to advocate as media workers, journalists, and policymakers, and NGOs, even the activists, to ensure that we go into these communities wherever they are and educate them about how climate change is linked to mental health. And they too could probably say to themselves, oh, I am really being affected by climate change. My mental health is being impacted, you know, and then they will be able to access the services that they need. But if we don't continue this process of educating people, and I mean, Candice rightfully said there's too many talk shops in this whole climate change thing, but I don't I see this conversation and podcasts like these, people listening and understanding the issues that are there, they will be able to, ensure that the policies are put in place to protect these people, to educate them, to get them the services that they need. And just think about it. We have, like I said, a population of over 700,000 people. Just 10% of that population is our indigenous people, which we have high regard for. They're the first people in our country. We need to do all that we can, as not just as people or our government, but everybody needs to ensure that they work together to protect this vulnerable group, not just in Guyana, but in Jamaica and other countries where they exist.
Yeah, Candice. So what should the government do? What should civil society do? What should NGOs do to address this matter for the indigenous people in Jamaica?
First of all, that was so eloquently said, Samuel. I don't know if I could. Let me not. But that was eloquently said, right? I agree. I think to a greater extent in Jamaica, that's also what we need to do. Education, sensitization comes first, and before that, the ratification of ILO 169. If that is not done, then nothing else can truly happen for the sake of indigenous people in Jamaica, where it matters and means something to help to protect them as a people, as a group of people. I keep going back to the conversation with Ronaldo. She's the only person I spoke with. However, she said it too, she said, ratify it and get everything else on the way, because without that, nothing else can take place. I quoted Chieftainess Ronaldo, and she said, it all ties back to indigenous people's rights. If we were properly acknowledged with policies and acts of government, and that paired with proper education and sensitization of our countrymen and women, the mental strain of climate change events on our community would not be so great. And she said that essentially to highlight that properly acknowledging the community means that tailored assistance for displacement because of climate change and protection of their ceremonial practices and everything that speaks to who they are in an ever-changing climate is what should be prioritized. So we can have all the talk shops we want, we can have all the suggested solutions that we want, but if we don't go back to that specific drawing board of ensuring that ILO 169 is ratified, then we're wasting our time. That's what I think.
Yeah, and then for those listening to us, if you're going through some sort of mental health crisis or going through mental health issues, reach out to a friend, reach out to a family member, reach out to an expert, use government official services to talk about your issues. But what you should do is reach out to any sort of individual that can help you go through your mental health issues. But don't keep quiet, don't bottle everything in. Reach out to your friends, reach out to colleagues, experts, or use government services. And with that, we come to an end of this episode of Caribbean Climate Calabash. Thank you so much, Samuel from Guyana and Candice from Jamaica. And for those listening and seeing us on YouTube, make sure to visit our website, CaribbeanClimateTracker.org, to see more of Samuel's and Candice stories and other CT Fellows stories. So until then, have a wonderful day.